My father pointed at me across a room full of 200 people, smiled his biggest smile, and said, "Every family has one. The one you cannot brag about. The embarrassment." That is Claire. The room laughed. My sister laughed. My mother looked away. And then the most decorated man in that ballroom, my sister's fiancé, a Navy SEAL commander, took one step backward, snapped to attention, raised his hand in a sharp, perfect salute, and said 4 words that stopped every conversation, shattered a champagne glass, and changed my family forever. Rear Admiral Hartwell. At ease. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And my father, the man who had called me nothing special for 20 years, could not remember how to blink. Stay with me. Because what happened next was not just about a salute. It was about what we do to the people we are supposed to love. And what it costs all of us when we finally stop pretending we do not see it. This story is for everyone who has ever been the overlooked one, and for everyone who looked away when they should not have. Before we go any further, if you have ever stood in a room full of people who were supposed to know you and felt completely invisible, this story was made for you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you are new here, hit subscribe right now, because every story on this channel is built around one question. What does it actually cost to be human? And what does it mean to do it with dignity? Now, let us begin. I want to tell you about the night my father made me the punchline of his favorite joke. He had been telling that joke for years. At kitchen tables, at holiday dinners, at charity events where he needed something to say that would make him sound relatable and warm and self-aware. The joke was simple. The setup was always the same. And the punchline was always me. My name is Claire Hartwell. I am 42 years old. I hold the rank of Rear Admiral in the United States Navy. I have commanded operations across 3 oceans, briefed Senate subcommittees on maritime security, and once spent 11 days coordinating a multinational crisis response that never made the evening news because the people involved preferred it that way. I tell you that not to impress you. I tell you that because on the night this story begins, my father stood in front of 200 people at a waterfront venue outside Charleston, South Carolina, pointed at me across a gleaming ballroom, and called me the family embarrassment. He said those exact words. He used them like a label, like something you print on a jar so people know not to expect too much from what is inside. He was laughing when he said it. 200 guests laughed with him. And then something happened that no one in that room, including me, could have predicted. My sister's fiancé, Commander Ryan Calloway of the United States Navy SEALs, stepped backward, squared his shoulders, raised his right hand in a salute so precise and so absolute that the jazz quartet stopped mid-phrase and champagne glasses froze mid-air, and said 4 words that split the evening wide open. Rear Admiral Hartwell, at ease. My father's champagne glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the hardwood floor. The sound of it breaking was the only sound in the room for what felt like a very long time. 200 people looked at me, not at the broken glass, not at Ryan, still holding the salute with perfect composure, at me, at the woman who had just been introduced as the family embarrassment. I am going to tell you what happened that night, but first I need to tell you who we all were before it, because the evening only makes sense if you understand the years that led to it. The choices made, the silences kept, the wounds carried so long, they stopped feeling like wounds and started feeling like furniture. And I need to tell you what I learned, not just about my family, but about all of us. Because this story is not really about a salute. It is about what happens when we spend decades refusing to see the people standing right in front of us. And it is about what that costs. Not just to the person being unseen, but to everyone in the room when the truth finally decides it has waited long enough. The venue that October evening was a converted plantation estate on the waterfront south of Charleston. Still warm. The way South Carolina holds on to summer longer than it should, and well past the point where the holding does any good. I had driven from the airport alone. I had booked a modest rental car and a room at a business hotel 20 minutes from the venue, because I had learned not to assume I would be welcome at the family house. I packed a simple navy blue civilian dress. I left my uniform in tissue paper at the bottom of my bag. That last detail matters. I made a deliberate choice to arrive as a sister, not as an officer. I was not there to perform. I was not there to make a point. I was there because some stubborn, persistent, perhaps foolish part of me still believed in the possibility that this time would be different. My executive officer had advised against going. She knew enough about my family to have opinions, and she shared them with the directness that good officers develop after years of watching rank fail to protect people from the things that actually hurt them. Ma'am, she said, why are you doing this to yourself? And I told her something I have thought about many times since that night, because I keep hoping they have changed. And someday, one of those times, need to be there when they have. She did not argue. She knew me well enough to understand that hope, even inconvenient hope, is not a weakness. It is one of the most human things we carry. The problem is we have to be honest with ourselves about what we find when we get there. That honesty, I would discover before the evening was over, cuts in more than one direction. The Hartwell family was what people in Greenville, South Carolina, called comfortable, not wealthy. Comfortable. My father, George Hartwell, built a regional hardware supply company from nothing across 30 years. 3 warehouses, 40 employees, a handshake reputation that opened doors in 3 counties. He was a man who understood power instinctively, who sought it naturally, and who measured other people primarily by how much of it they reflected back at him. He loved his family. I want to say that clearly, because love is going to become complicated in what follows, and I do not want to erase it. He loved us the way certain men of his generation loved, loudly, conditionally, and through the lens of what we made him look like to the people around him. My sister Natalie made him look exceptional. She was everything a man like George Hartwell could want in a daughter. Poised, charming, effortlessly social. Homecoming court, student council president. The kind of girl whose photographs you put on your office desk because they made you look like you had done something right with your life. She sparkled for audiences, and our father was always her most devoted one. I did not sparkle. I studied. I was methodical and focused and quietly fascinated by strategy, by systems, by the way complex operations either held together or fell apart based on the smallest decisions made under pressure. I could read a compass at 12. I rebuilt a small engine at 15. I read histories of naval warfare the way other teenagers read novels. My father called it being too much in my head. He compared me to Natalie approximately 400 times before I left home. I counted at some point and then stopped counting because the number stopped being useful. The night I received my appointment to the Naval Academy, I was 17 years old. I had applied in secret because I already understood how the announcement would land. I stood in our kitchen with the acceptance letter trembling in my hands. My mother, Diane, was at the counter slicing tomatoes for dinner. My father sat at the table reviewing invoices from the store. Got in, I said. Annapolis! Got in. My mother's knife paused. My father set down his paper and looked at me for a long moment. Then he sighed. The sigh of a man who has been interrupted by something inconvenient. Claire, he said, be serious. I am serious. That is a hard life. I know, I said. Hard on families, he said. I looked around that warm kitchen. The yellow curtains, the smell of pot roast, the hum of the refrigerator. I wanted someone to stand up and cross the room and put their hands on my shoulders and say, that is my girl. I wanted my mother to cry from pride. I wanted my father to call his brother Donald and say, you are not going to believe what your niece just did. Instead, he picked up his invoice. Your sister has her cheerleading finals next weekend, he said. Do not distract your mother with this right now. I went to my room and sat on my bed with the letter in my hands, and I did not cry. I had learned very young that crying in that house produced sympathy for whoever witnessed it, rather than for whoever was actually hurting. So I sat quietly with the biggest achievement of my 17 years as. And I understood something that would take me another 2 decades to fully accept. My worth in this family was not going to be recognized by this family. It was going to have to come from somewhere else. Graduated from Annapolis 3rd in my class. My parents did not attend. My father sent a card. My mother tucked a $20 bill inside. I served in positions that required security clearances I cannot fully discuss. I earned commendations. I advanced through ranks that take most officers a decade to reach. I made decisions that affected lives. that at least twice determined whether people came home from places they should never have had to be. He sent my family invitations to every promotion ceremony, all three of them. I believed for a long time that the invitations had gone unanswered because life got busy, because my father did not fully understand what the ceremonies meant, because my mother deferred to him and he deferred to indifference. Did not yet know what my Uncle Donald knew, but that revelation was still ahead. First, there was the party. The engagement party invitation arrived 3 weeks before the evening itself. Natalie Reed, formerly Natalie Hartwell, and Commander Ryan Calloway request the honor of your presence. The card was printed on cream stock that probably cost more per sheet than my first military paycheck. I found out about the engagement through Instagram before the invitation reached me. A photograph of a ring. 37 comments. A caption that said he asked and I said yes, with a string of small images I have never learned to properly decode. I set my phone face down on my desk at the Pentagon and looked out at the Potomac River for a while. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in a rental car in the parking lot of a waterfront estate south of Charleston, watching well-dressed strangers file through a lit entrance, telling myself for the fourth time that I could still drive away. I sat in that car for 4 minutes. I counted. Then I got out and walked inside. The ballroom was exactly what you would expect from Natalie's taste. Chandelier lighting, warm and golden. Floral arrangements in cream and ivory. A jazz quartet playing Ella Fitzgerald near the tall windows. 200 guests moving through the space with the particular ease of people who have never had to choose between the dress and the rent. My parents were near the champagne bar. My mother! Diane saw me first. Woo, she said. Not hello. Not it is so good to see you. Just oh, the way you might acknowledge a package arriving on an unexpected day. She hugged me briefly, with the practiced warmth of a woman who has learned to perform affection across a distance she cannot quite close. My father looked up from his conversation. Claire, he said. He did not cross the room. Hi, Dad, you actually made it, he said. A statement, not a welcome. Already looking past me for someone more interesting. I said I would. Right. That was the entire greeting. 24 hours of travel. 20 years of hoping. And that was it. I got myself a glass of sparkling water and spent the next half hour in the particular social purgatory of family events where no one quite knows what to do with you. Retired couple from Greenville asked what I did for work. I said I was in the Navy. The woman said, oh, how fun. Do you wear those little white outfits sometimes? The man mentioned that his cousin had driven boats in the 1960s. I said that sounded like good work and moved on. If you have ever been the family member who does not quite fit the frame, you know exactly how that half hour feels. You carry a glass of water from one cluster of conversation to another. You smile at the right times. You answer questions that reveal how little the people asking them have thought about you in the years since you last saw each other. You perform belonging with the quiet efficiency of someone who has learned that the performance is what is expected, and that pointing out the gap between performance and reality is considered the greater offense. That is the universal experience underneath this story. The feeling of standing in a room full of people who are supposed to know you, and understanding that you are essentially a stranger to all of them. Natalie found me near the windows at around 8 o'clock. She wore a white designer dress that had probably involved a consultant. She hugged me briefly, carefully, as though physical contact required a signed agreement. Claire, you look great. So do you. Are you still doing the Navy thing? She asked it the way you ask someone whether they are still taking those pottery classes they mentioned 2 summers ago. Curious in theory, indifferent in practice. Still doing it, I said. She laughed lightly. I do not know how you stand it. Then she was absorbed by the next cluster of guests, her smile recalibrating for the new audience before she had fully turned away from me. Ryan Calloway arrived from the terrace at 8:15. I had read his service record in a professional context several years earlier. Our careers had crossed at the operational level during a joint task force coordination, though we had never met in person. That is common at the command level. You make decisions that affect people you will never shake hands with. He was taller than I expected, broad-shouldered, comfortable in a suit in the way men are when they have spent enough years in combat gear that everything else feels uncomplicated by comparison. He worked the room with the easy competence of someone accustomed to building rapport quickly in difficult conditions. He shook hands. He told stories. He made my father's friends feel like the most interesting people in the room, which is a skill I respect enormously regardless of the context. Then Natalie guided him toward me. I extended my hand. Claire, I said. Ryan. His grip was measured and professional. His eyes moved across my face with the focused assessment of someone trained to read environments quickly. They paused for a fraction of a second on my left hand, specifically on my Naval Academy class ring. Something shifted in his expression. Small, controlled. The adjustment of a man who has just processed unexpected information and is deciding what to do with it. Nice to meet you, he said. Likewise, I replied, and moved to step back. I had not come to make the evening about me. I had not worn my rank. I had not announced myself. I had made every available choice in favor of a quiet night. But across the room, my father had been watching. And George Hartwell had never been able to resist a good line when he had an audience for it. Jake, my father called out across the room. He always used the wrong name first. It was a dominance habit. That small stumble, immediately corrected. That reminded everyone in earshot who controlled the room's narrative. He cleared his throat. Ryan, sorry. Come over here. There is someone you need to meet. One more member of the family. Ryan turned. Natalie touched his arm with the grip of a woman who has sensed something incoming. George set his champagne glass on a nearby tray and stepped to the center of the small gathering that had formed around us. He was wearing the smile I had known my entire life, wide, warm on its surface, and underneath it, the particular pleasure of a man who has a line ready and knows it is going to land. Now, he said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. Every family has one. Every single family, if they are being honest, has that one member. The one you cannot quite display at the mantle. The one who never quite fits the frame. A few people chuckled. A comfortable chuckle of guests who do not yet know where this is going, but trust the host to land it cleanly. George gestured toward me with an open hand. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, allow me to introduce the family embarrassment. He let that sit for one beat. Then two, my younger daughter, Claire. She does something in the Navy, has been doing it for 20-odd years. Nothing to write home about, honestly, but we keep her around for the holidays. Someone has to be the cautionary tale. The laughter that followed was loose and easy. My aunt laughed. A man from my father's business circle laughed. Two women near the centerpiece arrangement laughed in the way people laugh when they are not sure if something is mean, but the room's energy says to go along with it. My sister Natalie produced a sound that was technically a laugh, but had no warmth anywhere inside it. My mother looked at the floor. I smiled. The smile I had developed across 20 years of deployments, diplomatic negotiations, and Senate hearings. The smile that reveals nothing and costs everything. I had heard versions of that introduction my entire adult life. At Thanksgiving tables, at neighborhood cookouts, at charity dinners where my father needed something self-deprecating that made him seem relatable at someone else's expense. The delivery evolved slightly each time. The punchline was always the same, and the crowd always laughed. Because crowds take their cues from the most confident person in the room, and my father had never in his life lacked confidence. Ryan Calloway had not laughed. I noticed it immediately. He was standing with the stillness of a man who has trained himself not to react until he has fully assessed what is in front of him. His eyes had moved from my father to me, from me to my hands, from my hands back to my face. His expression was very carefully neutral. Ryan, my father continued, warming to his audience. Claire joined the Navy instead of doing anything particularly ambitious. We have made our peace with it. It is what it is. Some daughters become doctors and lawyers. Mine became whatever Claire is. More laughter. Ryan looked at my father, then at me. His gaze dropped once more to my left hand, to the Naval Academy class ring. And this time I watched the recognition move through him the way current moves through still water. Quiet, directional, irreversible. I saw the exact moment he understood who he was looking at. His body changed before he spoke. It was not a dramatic change. If you were not trained to notice these things, you might have missed it. His posture shifted in a way that had nothing to do with conscious decision and everything to do with 2 decades of military conditioning. His chin lifted, his shoulders squared. His feet moved to shoulder width apart. He took one step backward, then another. His right arm came up, sharp and clean, elbow at shoulder height. Fingers aligned. A salute executed with the precision of a man who had rendered this gesture in briefing rooms and on flight decks, and in places that will never appear in any public record. His voice, when it came, was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried the weight of absolute conviction into a room that had already gone completely silent. Rear Admiral Hartwell. The jazz quartet stopped mid-note. My father's champagne glass slipped from his fingers and struck the hardwood floor and shattered. And the sound of it breaking was the only sound in that ballroom for what felt like a very long time. 200 people looked at me. At ease. Commander, I said quietly. Ryan lowered his hand. He did not relax entirely. His eyes stayed on me with the steady, careful attention of a man who has just discovered he has been standing at the edge of something much larger than the party he thought he was attending. My father stood with his hands slightly apart, staring down at the broken glass and the wine spreading across the floor. And then up at me. And then at Ryan. What? He said. His voice had lost every trace of its performance quality. What did you just call her? Ryan turned to face him with the patience of a man who has explained difficult realities in far more dangerous circumstances than a South Carolina engagement party. Rear Admiral, he said. United States Navy, sir. The word sir, in that context, was not a courtesy. It was the precise deployment of military language to establish exactly who in that room held actual authority. And my father, who had spent his entire adult life being the loudest and most certain voice in every room he entered, had no response for it. The first thing that happened was that people reached for their phones. It started with one woman near the dessert table, then her husband, then a couple at the nearest table, then someone across the room, screens glowing in the chandelier light, thumbs moving, faces tilting down. My name traveled faster than any explanation my father could have constructed. Rear Admiral Claire Hartwell, Naval Academy graduate, class of 1999. Meritorious Service Medal, Legion of Merit, Joint Command Assignment, Multinational Maritime Security Operations, Defense Leadership Fellow. A woman near the back read the last part aloud before she realized she was doing it. Rear Admiral Hartwell was recognized for leadership in multinational. She began, then caught herself and went quiet, but not before everyone near her had heard. My father turned to me. He had the look of a man who has been running a particular game for a very long time and has just realized that the people across the table have known his cards for several rounds. She never said anything, he announced to the room, to Ryan, to no one specifically. She never told us any of this. There it was, the first line of defense. Not we never asked. Not we were not there. Not we dismissed every achievement she ever tried to share. Just she never told us. I kept my voice level. Dad, I said. I sent invitations to all 3 of my promotion ceremonies. His hand, which had been reaching for a napkin, went still. To what? He said. To my promotion ceremonies. The first one was in Norfolk. The second was in Washington. The most recent was 6 months ago. My mother pressed one hand to her chest. Natalie went very still. My father cleared his throat. We get a lot of mail, he said. Things get lost sometimes. A woman near the edge of our group looked at him then, not with sympathy, with the expression of a person who has just watched someone she respected say something that cannot be walked back. From across the room, a man moved toward us with the deliberate, unhurried walk of someone who has been waiting for the right moment and has decided it has arrived. Captain Frank Morrison was 71 years old, white-haired, with the posture of a man who had left the service in rank but never quite left it in bearing. I recognized him from a joint defense briefing in Norfolk 3 years earlier. I had not known he would be here tonight. He was connected to Ryan's extended circle through a mutual friend, someone in Natalie's future in-laws social group. He looked at my father with an expression that was not hostility. It was something more deflating than hostility. It was pity. George, he said. Frank, my father said. He attempted to recover some version of his usual authority. Glad you could make it. Frank Ferguson did not engage the pleasantry. I served 31 years, he said, to the room as much as to my father. He turned toward me. Then back. I have been in briefing rooms with 4-star generals, foreign defense ministers, and 3 secretaries of defense. He paused. The room, which had been slowly refilling with the ambient sound of a party, went quiet again. When Admiral Hartwell walks into a briefing, Frank continued. Every person in that room stands. Every one of them, without being asked. My father looked as though the language of the evening had changed without his permission. My mother sat down in the nearest chair. Well, my father said. He shifted his weight. I mean, we always knew she was doing well. We knew she was doing fine. Fine, Frank said. The word came out flat and brief. Then he looked around the room, and what he said next changed the atmosphere in a way that no accusation could have. I attended a joint briefing in Washington 2 years ago, he said. Admirals, generals, senior intelligence officials. Allied commanders from 4 nations were present. He looked directly at my father. When your daughter walked in and began her assessment, the room gave her a standing ovation. Not polite applause, a standing ovation. Someone near the back made a small, involuntary sound. My father opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Why? He said finally. His voice had dropped below its public register entirely. Why did you never tell us? Dad, I kept the word simple. You did not want to know, I said. There is a difference between not being told and not wanting to hear. You had the invitations. You had 20 years of occasions to ask a single question about what my life actually looked like. Nobody moved. I continued. Every few years, I convince myself that this time will be different. That this time someone will ask about my work, about whether I am well, about what it has cost me and what it has given me, and who I have become in the years since I left this family. And then something like tonight happens. The last sentence landed in that room with the weight of something that had been waiting a very long time to be put down. And then, from near the side corridor doorway, my Uncle Donald cleared his throat. Claire, he said quietly, can I have a moment? Donald Hartwell's was my father's older brother by 3 years. He had the same broad build, the same square jaw, but where George had always occupied space loudly and without apology, Donald had always stood at the edge of rooms, watching, saying less than he knew. He had been standing at the edge of my family's dynamic for decades, in the side corridor off the main ballroom, with the jazz quartet starting again at the worst possible moment, and its sound filtering through the wall in disconnected phrases. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at me. I have been carrying something for a long time, he said. I do not have a good excuse for why it took this long, so I am just going to say it. I waited. I was at your parents' house for Easter weekend 5 years ago, he said. The invitation for the Norfolk ceremony had arrived. I was there when your father went through the mail. His voice was steady, but there was an effort behind it. He picked up your envelope. Claire. I watched him read the return address. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put it in his shirt pocket. I was very still. That night, I heard him tell your mother that the mail must have gotten lost. He said you had probably forgotten to send anything. He said if it had really been important, you would have called. Donald stopped. The music drifted through the wall. I should have said something. He continued. That evening, or the next day, or at some point in the 5 years since. I watched you come to family events and be treated as though your life did not amount to much. And I said nothing. And I do not have a clean explanation for that. I told myself it was not my place, that it was between you and your father, that families work these things out eventually. He exhaled. None of that was true. It was easier. That is the honest answer. It was easier than starting a fight with my brother. There is a particular quality of grief that comes with this kind of revelation. Not the grief of loss exactly. More the grief of a suspicion confirmed that you have spent years hoping was wrong. I had told myself that my father was indifferent, that the invitations had been overlooked, that his cruelty was the passive kind, born of simply not paying attention. Passive cruelty is painful, but it is different from active choice. My father had chosen. Each time. Deliberately! And Donald had watched and said nothing. I want to say clearly that I do not tell you this to make Donald a villain. I tell you this because Donald is the most common character in stories like mine. Not the person doing the harm. Not the person absorbing it. The witness who has all the information required to intervene and cannot find the courage to use it. Donald was that person. And he was also the person who finally told me the truth in a side corridor at his nephew's engagement party at 70 years old. Both things are true. People are complicated in this way. Thank you for telling me, I said. He nodded. He looked like a man who had expected more and understood he deserved less. What will you do? He asked. I looked toward the ballroom doorway. Through it, I could see the party reforming in the wake of the salute. My father near the center of the room, surrounded by guests whose expressions had shifted from celebration to something more careful. Ryan standing near Natalie with his arms folded and his jaw set, working through something. Frank Morrison speaking quietly to a man across the room. I am going back in there, I said. And having the conversation we should have had 20 years ago. I walked back through the doorway. The room felt different when I entered it. Not quieter exactly, but altered the way a room feels after a window has been opened in a storm. The air had changed. People were still holding their champagne, still wearing their evening clothes, still standing in the clusters they had occupied all night. But something had shifted in the quality of their attention. My father was near the center of the room. He had stopped trying to control the narrative. That alone told me something significant. I walked directly to him. He watched me approach with the expression of a man who has been running a particular version of reality for a very long time and can feel it ending. Dad, I said, I know about the invitations. The color in his face shifted. I am not asking for an explanation tonight, I said. I am telling you what I know, and I am asking you one question. Just one. He looked around the room, instinctively, looking for his audience before anything else. The habit of a lifetime. I waited until his eyes came back to me. Why? I said quietly. For 20 years. Why was it so impossible for you to be proud of me? Then my father, who had never in my living memory failed to have an answer for anything, stood in front of 200 witnesses and said nothing for a very long time. My father looked at his hands. It was such a small gesture, such an uncharacteristically quiet one. But he looked at his own hands the way people do when they are trying to locate something they buried so deep they are no longer certain where they put it. I applied to the Naval Academy, he said. The words came out at about half his usual volume. 1974. I was 18 years old. A stillness moved through the people near enough to hear him. My uncle Donald, who had followed me back into the room and stood now near the doorway, went very still. His face told me this was new information, even to him. I had the whole thing planned out in my head, my father continued. Annapolis. Service. I had been reading about it since I was 10 years old. I had decided by the time I was 14 that it was exactly what I wanted. He exhaled slowly. I failed the physical. Depth perception. Something they said was not correctable. The letter came in March. He stopped, kept that letter for a year before I threw it away. I never told your mother. I never told Donald. I told nobody, not a single person in 50 years. The room near us had gone quiet. I want to be careful here about what I say, because this is a place where it is easy to move in the wrong direction. His pain was real. The boy of 18 who received that rejection letter and carried it alone for a year and buried it so thoroughly that not even his brother knew about it for 50 years. That pain was real, and it had a shape, and it mattered. And it was not my debt to pay. Both of those things are true. Holding both at once is uncomfortable. It is also necessary. When I look back now at 20 years of dismissal, at the joke at my expense, at the invitations hidden in a shirt pocket, at every kitchen conversation where my achievements were used as contrast to make Natalie shine more brightly, I can see the shape of it clearly. My father had not hated my military career. He had mourned his own. Every ceremony I attended, every rank I earned, every accomplishment he minimized and deflected and refused to acknowledge. It had all been the shadow of a door he had tried to walk through at 18 and found locked. He had not failed to see me. He had seen me too clearly. He had seen everything he had wanted to be, and he had never found a way to carry that grief without it becoming something corrosive. Your disappointment, I said after a long moment. Whatever happened when you were 18, that was not mine to absorb for 20 years. He looked up. I am sorry that door was closed for you, I said. I mean that. And the way that hurt moved through you and became the way you treated me. Those are not the same wound. One belongs to you alone. The other belongs to us both. His jaw moved once. He nodded, the nod of a man with no argument left, which is the rarest thing George Hartwell had ever produced. My mother appeared at my side. She had moved so quietly through the room that I had not noticed her approaching. Diane Hartwell had spent 45 years moving quietly through spaces that belonged in the social architecture of her marriage to her husband. She had learned to be present without disturbing the established order of things. She touched my arm. Claire, she said. Can I show you something? We moved to the coat room off the side corridor. Cedar and cold air and the lingering scent of a dozen different perfumes. My mother reached into her handbag, a sensible navy blue purse she had carried for probably 6 years, and removed from it a small photo album. The drugstore kind, worn at the corners, the spine soft from handling. She held it out to me with both hands. I opened it. The first page held a newspaper clipping from the Greenville Register. Local graduate earns top honors at Naval Academy. My graduation photograph. 1999. I was 22 years old and squinting slightly in the sun and wearing the expression of someone trying very hard not to look as overwhelmed as they felt. The next page. A printed email announcing my first command assignment. Then a photograph taken from a balcony at a defense conference in Washington. You could barely make out my face. Someone had photographed the front of the room from a distance and circled one of the figures at the podium with blue ink. The circle was around me, page after page. 23 years of my life, preserved in a drugstore album, carried in a navy blue purse. I collected everything I could find. My mother said. Her voice was just above a whisper, when I could not attend. I looked. I always looked. Claire. Mom, I said. Why did you not come? She looked at her hands. The same gesture my father had used. A family inheritance. What the body does when the words are not enough. Your father would have made things very difficult, she said. I looked at the album in my hands. At the worn corners? At the careful placement of each clipping. I am not showing you this to make it better, she said. I know it does not make it better. I am showing you because you deserve to know that you were never invisible to me. She stopped. I was not brave enough. And that is something I will have to live with. There is a particular kind of grief in watching a parent show you, simultaneously, how much they loved you and how badly they failed you. Both things can be true. The love does not erase the failure. The failure does not erase the love. Holding both at once is one of the harder things human beings are asked to do. I closed the album carefully and held it for a moment. Then I handed it back. Keep it, I said. We will talk. Not tonight, but we will talk. Her face broke open the way faces do when they have been held together longer than they were meant to hold. She nodded. I returned to the main room to find that a different conversation had been happening in my absence. Ryan Calloway had found Natalie near the tall windows on the far side of the ballroom. She was standing alone, separated from the guests who had been giving the Hartwell family a careful radius of polite distance for the last hour. I did not hear the beginning of their conversation, but I moved close enough to hear what mattered. When your father introduced Claire tonight, Ryan was saying, his voice was low and without any edge in it, which somehow made it more serious. When he called her the family embarrassment, and the room laughed. What did you feel? Natalie had her arms crossed. She was looking out at the harbor through the glass. The lights of the boats moved slowly on the dark water. I laughed, she said. You were there. You saw me. I know, Ryan said. I am asking what you felt while you were laughing. A pause. Natalie uncrossed her arms. It was a small movement, but I recognized it as the physical equivalent of a person releasing something they have been holding for a long time. Relieved, she said. The word came out more quietly than she had intended. I felt relieved. Because when he goes after Claire, he is not going after me. I have been feeling that relief since we were children. Ryan? Every time Dad turned his focus on her, some part of me was grateful. And I have never said that out loud to anyone in my entire life. Ryan was quiet for a moment. That is honest, he said. It is not something I am proud of. I know, he said. Natalie. She turned from the window. Staying quiet while someone is being hurt is not neutrality. His voice was still calm, but the words had weight behind them. Silence has a shape. It has a cost. And the person paying that cost is not the one who stays quiet. She pressed her lips together. I know that. So what do we do about it? Ryan said. Not as an accusation, as a genuine question. What do we actually do going forward? That question is the only useful one that exists after a revelation like the one that evening had produced. Not who was wrong, not who was hurt most, not whose fault was it and for how long. Just, what do we do about it from here? I moved away before Natalie saw me listening. Some conversations need to finish themselves without an audience. Ryan found me near the entrance 20 minutes later. Ma'am, he said, there is something I should have told you. earlier, when I spoke in the ballroom about the Arabian Sea operation. I told the room the part I could share. But there is something else. I waited. 7 years ago, there was a young sailor in my unit, he said, Petty Officer Second Class. His name was Tommy Graves. 23 years old. From Greenville, South Carolina. After a particularly difficult operation, one that went right because of a decision from your command. He was struggling in the way young service members sometimes struggle when they carry things they cannot talk about. Ryan paused. Someone wrote him a letter, not because protocol required it, because someone noticed that Tommy needed to hear something true about himself at a moment when the weight of his service was close to becoming too heavy. The letter said that performing with excellence under pressure is not the absence of fear, but the decision to continue moving forward despite it. That Tommy Graves had demonstrated exactly that. He looked at me. That letter was also sent to his family. His mother is a retired school teacher. She taught Sunday school in Greenville for nearly 30 years. She showed that letter to Natalie about 4 years ago. She told your sister that she did not know who had written it, but that whoever it was truly understood what service costs. Ryan paused. She said she had never read anything that described it more honestly. His eyes met mine. The letter was signed by you, he said. Did not remember it immediately. I had written letters like it across the years, when someone warranted one, when I could see clearly that words from someone of rank would mean something real to a young person carrying something heavy. Tommy Graves! Arabian Sea, 2016. Yes, I said. I remember him. Ryan nodded slowly. The world is smaller than we think it is, he said. The good we put into it does not disappear. It moves through connections we cannot trace and comes back to us in rooms we could never have predicted. He looked across the ballroom toward Natalie, who was speaking quietly now with my mother near the window. Tommy is doing well, Ryan said. He finished his service. He is in graduate school now. His mother still has that letter on her refrigerator. I looked out at the harbor lights beyond the glass. Thank you for telling me, I said. I found my father near the terrace doors. The party had not ended, but it had transformed. The jazz quartet played at a subdued volume, as though they had read the room and adjusted accordingly. Small clusters of guests continued their conversations, with the careful quiet of people who understand they have witnessed something that will take time to fully comprehend. I crossed the room and stopped beside him. He was looking out at the harbor through the glass. The water was dark and the lights of the boats moved on it slowly. Dad, I said. He turned. The performance was entirely gone now. What remained was a man in his late 60s who had built his identity on a particular story about himself and his family, and was standing in the rubble of that story without a plan for what came next. I want to say something to you, I said, and I need you to hear it without responding immediately. He nodded. What you did with those invitations, I said, hiding them. I understand more now about why than I did 2 hours ago. Understanding it does not make it right. I need you to know that clearly. What you chose to do across 20 years of occasions when you could have chosen differently, that cost me something I cannot get back. Not the ceremonies themselves. The experience of having my father present for the life I was building. That is what is gone. He was very still. And I also need you to hear this. I continued. I do not hate you. I am not saying that to comfort you. I am saying it because it is true and because I think honesty is the only thing that can be useful between us at this point. I am tired and I am sad and I have a great deal of thinking to do about what comes next. But I am not going to stand in this room and hate my father. His jaw moved. I was wrong, he said. The words came out rough, as though they had not been used much and were not accustomed to the shape of his mouth. I was wrong, Claire, for a long time. Yes, I said. You were. I did not soften it. Softening it would have been a kindness to him at the expense of the truth. And I had learned enough in my career about what happens when truth gets softened for the comfort of the person who most needs to hear it. I would like to come, he said after a moment. To something, a ceremony, if you will, allow it. I have a ceremony in February, I said, in Washington. I will have my office send you the information, both of you. He nodded carefully. But Dad, I waited until he was looking directly at me. If you come to see me, not to manage how it looks for the people around you, not to collect a story to tell afterward. You come to see your daughter. Just that. Yes, he said. Then I will see you in February. I collected my coat from the coat room. I said goodnight to Frank Morrison, who nodded at me with the understanding of a man who has witnessed many complicated evenings and knows better than to try to summarize them. I said goodnight to my Uncle Donald, who shook my hand and held it a moment longer than necessary and did not need to say anything because everything he needed to say had already been said in the corridor. Natalie caught me near the entrance. She looked like someone who had been crying recently and had decided to stop and was holding that decision through effort rather than ease. Claire, she said. Natalie. A pause. The kind that contains several different sentences that none of them know how to start. I do not have the right words yet, she said. I know that. But I want you to know that I am going to try. To be different. To be the sister I should have been. I am not asking you to trust that right now. I looked at her, at my older sister, who had spent our entire childhood being held up as the standard I could not meet, and who I was beginning to understand had paid her own costs for that position, just in different currency. I know you mean it, I said. I pushed open the door and walked out into the October night. The air was warm and salted, and it tasted like the harbor and something older than the harbor. The music from the venue drifted through the walls, faint and muffled, like something from a different story than the one I had just lived through. I sat in my rental car. I called my executive officer. How was it? She said. Complicated, I said. Are you all right? I looked out at the parking lot, at the lit entrance of the venue, at the shapes of people visible through the tall windows, still moving through the remains of an evening that had not gone the way anyone had planned. Yes, I said. Actually, yes. And for the first time that night. I meant it completely. February came. My parents drove to Washington together. My mother wore a dark red dress and held the small American flag that someone had handed her at the door of the ceremony hall. My father arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the fourth row with his hands on his knees. He said very little to the officials and officers seated around him. When the room stood and rendered honors, my father stood. He did not look around him to assess who was watching. He did not calculate the moment for its social value or position himself to tell a better version of it later. He looked at me. I have thought about that look many times since. There was nothing performed in it. It was the face of a man seeing someone clearly, perhaps for the first time, and understanding with full weight what it had cost them both to wait this long to get here. It was not enough to repair 20 years. I want to be honest about that. A ceremony does not undo a childhood. A look of recognition does not return the milestones that were missed, the letters that were hidden, the ordinary moments of acknowledgement that a person spends a lifetime unconsciously waiting for and eventually learns to stop expecting. But it was a beginning. And sometimes a beginning is the most significant thing in the world. 6 weeks after the engagement party, Natalie sent me a letter. It was longer than I expected and more honest than I believed she was capable of at that point. She wrote about Tommy Graves' mother and about the letter I had written and about the moment she finally understood that the sister she had spent decades measuring herself against had been, all along, doing work that mattered in the world in ways that had nothing to do with their father's approval. I think I needed to be smaller than you, she wrote, because I did not know who I was if I was not the chosen one. That is a terrible reason to participate in someone's erasure. I am not asking you to forgive me quickly. I only want you to know that I am working on becoming someone worth forgiving. That letter took courage. Late, imperfect, necessary courage. I wrote back, not forgiveness. Not yet. An open door. Ryan and Natalie did not immediately re-engage their relationship after that evening. They took 8 months. They had difficult and necessary conversations. Natalie did work she had been avoiding for decades. The quiet, unglamorous work of looking honestly at who you have been and making a deliberate choice about who you want to be instead. Ryan was patient and direct in equal measure, which I believe is exactly the combination that makes real change possible. They married the following June, in a small ceremony in the Low Country. I attended. When Ryan shook my hand at the reception, he said, "Thank you for existing, Admiral. You made this family better just by refusing to disappear." I have thought about that phrase a great many times since. Refusing to disappear. What a thing! To have that named as a form of courage. And now I want to talk to you directly, not as a rear admiral. not as someone who was saluted in front of 200 people at her sister's engagement party, just as a person who lived something difficult and thought carefully about what it meant. Here is what I know to be true. Dignity is not something other people give you. It is something you refuse to surrender. For 20 years, my family tried to define me through dismissal. The family embarrassment, the daughter who does something in the Navy. Nothing to write home about. And for 20 years, I continued doing work I believed in, building a life that was real, becoming someone who mattered to people far beyond the walls of that Charleston ballroom, not for the benefit of an audience that was not watching. Because the value of what you do does not depend on whether the people at your childhood kitchen table can see it. That is available to every one of us. The version of yourself that exists independent of other people's limitations, other people's wounds, other people's inability to see past their own grief and history, long enough to recognize what is standing in front of them. That version cannot be taken away. It can only be abandoned. Do not abandon it. The second thing, silence in the face of cruelty is not neutrality. When you stay quiet while someone is being diminished, you have made a choice. You have chosen your comfort at the cost of their dignity. This is true in families. It is true in workplaces. It is true everywhere that one person's ease is purchased with another person's erasure. We all have the capacity to be the person who says, simply and plainly, this is not right. We do not need rank for that. We do not need the perfect moment. We only need the willingness to use our voice before the cost of not using it becomes someone else's to pay. The third thing, the cruelty we pass forward almost always begins with a wound we have not examined. My father spent decades diminishing my military career because he had been denied one at 18 and never healed from that loss. He did not know he was doing it. I genuinely believe that, but not knowing does not end the harm. Understanding where cruelty comes from matters, not to excuse it, but to interrupt it. Because wounds that go unnamed in one generation become inherited burdens in the next. The fourth thing, forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. Forgiveness is the work you do for yourself. It is the decision to put down what you have been carrying so that you can move more freely through your own life. It does not require the other person to change. Reconciliation is different. Reconciliation requires the other person to actually become different, to show up differently, consistently, over time, until trust has something real to grow in. You are allowed to offer one without the other. You are allowed to forgive someone and still require different behavior before the relationship can rebuild. Those two things can coexist. And the last thing, the most important, every person deserves to be seen, not compared. Not ranked against a sibling or evaluated against some version of themselves that would be more convenient for the people around them. Not tolerated. Not used as contrast to make someone else shine. Simply, honestly, fully seen. My family missed 20 years of knowing me. That is a loss we all carry in different ways. But they are here now, imperfectly, effortfully, genuinely here, and so am I. If you are someone who has been told, in small ways or large ones, over many years or in a single crushing moment, that you are the lesser one, the disappointment, the one who never quite fits the frame, I want you to hear this clearly. You were never the family embarrassment. You were always the story worth telling. The room just needed to go quiet enough to hear it. And for anyone in your life who has been carrying their achievements alone, in rooms where no one came, at ceremonies where they sat in the fourth row by themselves, please reach out. Ask about their work. Ask about their life. Ask if they are well. It costs nothing to see someone, and it means everything to be seen. If this story reached something real in you today, leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from and whether you believe people can truly change when the truth finally arrives. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you are new here, subscribe because every story on this channel is about the same thing underneath: what it costs to be human, and what it means to do it with dignity. You are not alone in any room you have ever stood in, wondering if anyone would notice if you disappeared. Someone always notices. Sometimes they just need a salute to finally say so out loud. We have reached the end of Claire's story. But I do not want to let you go without saying the things that matter most. The things underneath the salute, underneath the broken champagne glass, underneath the dramatic moment that changed one family's evening in a waterfront ballroom in South Carolina. Because the truth is, most of us will never have a Navy SEAL fiancé at our family reunion. Most of us will not have our rank confirmed by a retired captain in front of 200 witnesses. Most of us will not get that perfect, cinematic moment when the room goes silent and everyone finally sees us. Most of us will get something quieter and harder and more real. So here is what I want you to carry from this story. If someone in your life has been where Claire's father was dismissive, diminishing, present in body but absent in witness, you do not owe them a quick return to normal. You do not owe them the performance of healing before the healing is real. Forgiveness, when it comes, is a gift you give yourself. It is the decision to stop letting someone else's choices live rent-free in your body and your future. It is not the same as trust. It is not the same as closeness. It is not the same as pretending the damage did not happen. Take the time it actually takes. Do the work that is actually required. And require the people who hurt you to do their work too consistently, over time, in actions, rather than apologies before you open the door all the way. George Hartwell missed 20 years of knowing his daughter. 20 years of ceremonies he could have attended. 20 years of letters he could have opened. 20 years of a relationship he could have had with a woman who, as it turned out, was one of the most accomplished people he would ever stand near in his entire life. This content was researched, developed, and manually edited by our team with the sole intention of bringing meaning, human value, and real lessons to every person who watches it. No detail in this story was included by accident. Every word was chosen because someone, somewhere, needed to hear it.